The second section of Chapter 34 follows the pathway of blood through the heart. Before we get into the details about the actual pathway, you need to be familiar with the anatomy of the heart. And when I refer to the right-hand side versus the left-hand side, how it's actually opposite. So looking at the picture of the heart, you'll notice that the right atrium is on the left-hand side of the screen, and the left atrium is on the right-hand side of the screen. The reason that it seems like they're opposite is because when we're talking about the right atrium, it's actually on the right-hand side of the actual organism. So it'd be similar to me and you facing each other. If I raise my right hand and you raise your right hand, we're going to be opposite because we're facing each other. So in terms of looking at this, when I refer to the left-hand side, please note it'll be on the right-hand side of the screen, but in actuality, the left-hand side of the organism. The next thing that you need to be familiar with is a little bit of the terminology. So the aorta is the main artery that pumps blood away from the heart, and this is oxygenated blood. The other parts that you should be familiar with are the right atrium, again, the right side of the organism, but on the left-hand side of the screen. The atrium is where the blood arrives at the heart and it's deoxygenated or oxygen poor, and you'll see it in a blue color. Other parts you need to be aware of: the right ventricle. So ventricles are where the blood is going to vacate the heart, and if you look at the right ventricle, kind of in the middle of the screen, the blood is deoxygenated or oxygen poor. The left ventricle, again, blood is going to vacate the heart here, and we will have oxygen-rich blood, so you'll note the reddish color. Other parts, what did I miss? The left atrium as well, where oxygenated blood is going to arrive at the heart. Now I'm going to get into more detail on the next slide about how and why the blood is leaving and coming into the heart and where it's getting oxygenated and losing its oxygen as well on the next slide. Okay, I'm going to go over the complete blood pathway. I'm going to be starting at the right ventricle, where the blood is going to vacate or be pumped to the lungs. How does it leave? It leaves through the pulmonary artery, and then the capillaries oxygenate the blood and release carbon dioxide. Next, the blood is going to arrive at the left atrium, and then the left ventricle is able to pump the oxygen-rich blood out to the different systemic units of the body. It leaves through the aorta, which is the main artery, to the capillary beds of different parts of our body. So going to the arms and the head and our arms versus going to our abdomen and our legs. When it crosses through the parts of the body, now the oxygen or the blood is deoxygenated or oxygen poor, and it needs to return back to the heart via the vena cava, which is a large vein. There are two vena cavas because the blood had been separated from our head, forearms, versus our abdomen and limbs. So the superior vena cava is what receives the blood from the upper part of our body, and the inferior vena cava vein receives that oxygen poor blood from the bottom part of our body. And then the blood, as it goes through that vein, it arrives at the right atrium and then switches into the right ventricle, and then the whole system starts all over again. Now, I'll try when this video uploads to point out the spots like using the cursor so you can kind of follow the pathway, but this is a pathway that you should be very familiar with and essentially kind of memorize. The rhythmic pattern of our heart beating is our cardiac cycle. And what causes our cardiac cycle is when our heart is relaxed, it fills with blood. And then when our heart contracts or tightens up, it pumps blood to the rest of our body. Our cardiac cycle has two words that you need to be familiar with. Systole, which is the actual contraction or pumping phase of our heart, and diastole, which is the relaxation or filling phase of our heart. So cardiac cycle has the two parts to it. The volume of blood that our ventricle pumps per minute is known as cardiac output. And cardiac output depends on two factors. One of these factors is our heart rate, which is the number of beats per minute. For us, 72 beats per minute is when we're at rest. The other factor that cardiac output depends on is stroke volume. Stroke volume is the amount of blood that's pumped by our left ventricle during its tightening or contraction, and it's equivalent of approximately 70 milliliters. If you multiply the two values, stroke volume and heart rate, the total will be about 4,900, almost 5,000 milliliters per minute, which is the equivalent of 5 liters per minute. 5 liters being our entire volume of blood in our human body. This picture illustrates the cardiac cycle and when the heart is relaxed versus when it's contracting. And because there's different chambers of the heart, different parts are able to be contracted versus relaxed at different times. So starting at number 1, the atrium and the ventricles are all relaxed. They are all filling with blood, and again, this is known as the diastole phase. Working up to number 2, so clockwise. Oh, and the last phase takes 0.4 seconds. Okay, so number 2, taking a tenth of a second, the atrium contracts, or it's doing its systole phase. I circled with the red circles, if you can see them. That's the part of the heart that's contracting. Now, why does the atrium contract? It allows the ventricles, which are underneath, to fill with blood before it gets pumped to the rest of the body. So the ventricles at this part, they're different. The atrium is contracting, the ventricles are relaxed and able to fill with blood. And then the next part down at the bottom, part 2, the ventricles are now ready to pump the blood through the body. So the right ventricle is going to pump the blood to the lungs to get oxygenated. So there's ventricular systole taking place there. Again, that ventricle is contracted. And then the left ventricle is going to pump the blood through the aorta to the rest of the body. And at this point, so those two parts are contracted or in their systole phase. The atrium, though, are relaxed or in that diastole phase. So for most of this, the atrium are typically relaxed with the exception of that tenth of a second. It's important that the blood of our circulatory system goes in the right direction. And there are valves, 4 valves, that prevent the backflow of blood in our heart. And these valves are flaps made of connective tissue. The first valves that you need to know are called the atrioventricular valves, or AV valves. These separate each atrium and ventricle, and when that ventricle contracts, the systole phase of the ventricle, and pumps the blood out of the heart, it's important that that blood doesn't backtrack into the atrium. The other two valves that you need to know are the semilunar valves, and the semilunar valves control the blood flow to the aorta and the pulmonary artery. So these are the valves as the blood actually exits the heart, leaving from the left ventricle to the aorta and leaving from the right ventricle to the pulmonary artery, which is going to go across the lungs. Now, what we hear is a heartbeat, that da-da, 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 da-da sound that we always hear. That's actually caused by the valves. So the book says it's a lub dub. I think of it as like a da-da, da-da kind of a sound. But the lub part, the first part of the sound that you hear, is the blood going against the closed atrioventricular valve. Again, as the ventricle is contracting, not letting that blood go in the wrong direction, going backwards. The second sound that you hear is the semilunar valves. Again, the blood is exiting the heart and not letting it come backwards. Now, occasionally there is backflow of blood through a defective valve, and this can be caused, it could be a birth defect. So I was born with a mild heart murmur, which I think I grew out of because I haven't heard anything since I was small about it. And other things can cause heart murmurs, whether it's some sort of damage to the heart, inflammation, infection. But heart murmurs, they don't necessarily have to be a bad thing depending on how much blood is causing a backflow. One of the amazing things about the heart is that the heart cells, some of the heart cells, do not actually need a signal from the nervous system in order to pulse. There is a part of the heart which controls those heart cells in coordinating the contractions and the relaxing. That part of the heart is called the sinoatrial node, or SA node. It's the pacemaker of the heart that controls that coordinated rhythm. The process of the cells not actually needing the nervous system at all is called autorhythmic. So some of those heart cells are autorhythmic, not needing a signal from the nervous system. And again, having electrical impulses. When you ever go to a hospital, doctor, and they need to do an EKG or an ECG, it's an electrocardiogram, they're detecting that electrical impulse, that auto rhythm of your heart. In addition to the auto rhythm and that SA node pacemaker controlling the heart, your heart also takes cues from your nervous system in two parts of your nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. The sympathetic division of your nervous system speeds up your pacemaker. So this is where fight or flight can come in, brisk walking, running, just physical movement will speed up that pacemaker or that SA node. The other part of your nervous system, the parasympathetic, slows down. So if you were being active and then you sat down and rested and breathed in deep, breathing in lots of oxygen to your body, that will slow down your pacemaker. The pacemaker or SA node is also regulated by hormones, which ties into the sympathetic division of your nervous system. So again, what I was saying, fight or flight, you also release hormones when there's something going on. Epinephrine, or adrenaline is released. And also if there's an increase in temperature, that can speed up your pacemaker as well.